Rain fell over Atlanta in thin silver sheets, the kind that softened the noise of the city without ever quite washing it clean. Amelia Banks stood at the bus stop on Fifth Street with a garment bag draped over one arm and a canvas tote digging red lines into her shoulder, and she watched the traffic crawl past like it had nowhere better to be either. She had nowhere better to be. That was the problem. 3 dress alterations. 2 prom gowns and a wedding bodice sat finished in that garment bag, ready for delivery to a boutique on Peachtree that paid her $30 apiece and acted like it was doing her a favor. $30. She'd spent 6 hours on the bodice alone picking out a beading pattern by hand because the bride wanted something her grandmother might have worn, and by the time she'd finished, her fingers had gone numb and her eyes had blurred at the edges. She did the math anyway, the way she always did the math, walking home in the rain. 30 times 3 plus the alterations minus the thread and the bus fare minus what she owed on Emma's inhaler refill minus what was already 3 weeks late on the electric bill. The numbers never came out even. They never had, not since Marcus left, not since the hospital bills for Noah's asthma attack had swallowed what savings they'd scraped together, not since the divorce lawyer had taken the rest. She was 30 years old, and she counted pennies the way other people counted blessings. The bus was late. Everything was late these days except the bills. That was when she saw it, a dark leather wallet lying half open on the wet sidewalk near the corner, its edge caught against a storm drain like it was one gust of wind away from disappearing forever. She almost walked past it. In this neighborhood, on this corner, a wallet on the ground usually meant someone had already taken what mattered and left the rest. But something made her stop. Maybe it was the leather, soft, expensive, the kind of leather that had never known a discount rack. She crouched, ignoring the wet seeping through her jeans, and picked it up. It was heavier than she expected. She opened it under the awning of a closed dry cleaner out of the rain, and her breath caught somewhere between her ribs. Cash. A lot of it, she didn't count it there on the street, but even a glance told her it was more than she made in 2 months of alterations. Credit cards black and platinum, the kind she'd only ever seen in magazines. A folded stack of business documents. And a driver's license with a photograph of a man with steady eyes and the kind of face that looked like it rarely needed to raise its voice to be obeyed. Lucas Rivers. She didn't recognize the name, not then. She only knew that whoever he was, he had just lost something that could change her life, and she had exactly one choice to make. Amelia thought about it the whole walk home, rain soaking through her sneakers, the wallet, a small brick of temptation in her tote bag. She thought about Emma's outgrown winter coat sleeves creeping up past her wrists. She thought about Noah's inhaler, the amber bottle sitting 3/4 empty on the kitchen windowsill because she'd been stretching the doses to make it last. She thought about the eviction notice folded into a drawer, not gone, just postponed by a promise, and a partial payment she'd begged the landlord to accept. She could take out enough to cover it all. Just enough. Nobody would ever know. A stranger dropped his wallet in the rain and never came looking. It happened every day in a city this size. But her mother's voice moved through her the way it always did in moments like this. Quiet and unhurried. The way Margaret Banks used to talk when she was folding laundry or shelling peas on the porch, never looking up, never raising her voice, and somehow always landing exactly where it needed to land. If you lose your integrity, baby, you've already paid too high a price. Everything else you can earn back. That you can't. Amelia had heard her mother say it so many times growing up that as a teenager she'd rolled her eyes at it the way teenagers do at anything that sounds like wisdom instead of permission. It was only after her mother died, only after Amelia became a mother herself, and started hearing her own voice echo with the same cadences that she understood her mother hadn't been reciting a saying. She'd been describing the only kind of wealth she'd ever had. By the time Amelia reached her small rented house with its sagging porch step and its window boxes full of herbs instead of flowers, because herbs were cheaper and useful, she had already decided she would find him. Emma was 9 and had her mother's habit of noticing everything. She looked up from the kitchen table where she was folding a stack of finished hems into tissue paper with the careful seriousness of someone twice her age and said, "You're soaked, Mama." "I'm fine, baby." "You don't look fine. You look like you found something." Amelia laughed despite herself and set the tote bag on the counter. Noah 6 was under the table with his dinosaurs, making the kind of low rumbling noise that 6-year-olds believe passes for a T-Rex. He poked his head out at the word found. "Found what?" "A wallet." She pulled it out careful like it might bite her. Somebody's wallet with a lot of money in it. Emma's eyes went wide. Noah scrambled up from under the table so fast he bumped his head, and neither he nor his sister said anything for a moment because even at 6 and 9 children who have grown up watching their mother stretch every dollar until it screams understand exactly what a lot of money means and exactly what it could buy. Are we keeping it? Noah asked. Hopeful. Already picturing something new. Shoes maybe, or the tablet game his friend Deshaun wouldn't stop talking about. No baby. We're finding whoever lost it. But Emma started and stopped herself because Emma was 9 and understood more than she said out loud. She looked at the wallet, then at her mother's face, and something in her expression settled like she already knew how this would go and had decided to be proud of it before it even happened. Grandma would say the same thing, Emma said quietly. Amelia's throat tightened. Yeah, she would. But it took her 2 days to find him because the wallet contained no phone, and every attempt to call the number on the business card taped inside went to a voicemail box that was full. She finally tracked down the address on one of the documents, Rivers Retail Holdings, a corporate office downtown in a glass tower that made her feel very small and very aware of the coffee stain on her sleeve. The lobby alone was larger than her entire house. Marble floors, a fountain, a security desk manned by 2 men in suits who looked at her like she'd wandered in from the wrong century. I need to return something, she told them, holding up the wallet like proof of purpose. It belongs to a Mr. Rivers. One of the guards picked up a phone, spoke in low tones, and within minutes a young woman in a sharp blazer appeared, introduced herself as Lucas Rivers's assistant Priya, and led Amelia to a small conference room on the ground floor, apologizing that Mr. Rivers was in back-to-back meetings, but would absolutely want to thank her personally. He's been frantic, Priya said, laughing a little in the exhausted way of someone who has spent 2 days managing a crisis that wasn't really a crisis, not to anyone with real problems. Not about the money, about his father's watch. There's a photo of it in one of those documents, sentimental thing, and his ID, obviously, and some paperwork he needed for a deal that's closing this week. It's all here, Amelia said, sliding the wallet across the table. I didn't take anything out. I counted it in front of my kids so they'd know exactly what was in there before I brought it back, and so would I. Priya blinked clearly, not expecting that detail, and something in her expression softened into genuine warmth. That's rare, you know. People don't usually explain themselves when they do the right thing. They just expect credit for it. I'm not looking for credit, Amelia said. I just didn't want there to be any question. Lucas Rivers arrived 11 minutes later, moving fast. Tie-loosened sleeves rolled to the forearm. The harried energy of a man who had genuinely been worried rather than performing worry for an audience. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had probably been handsome even when it was younger and thinner and hungrier, though Amelia didn't know that yet. What she noticed first was that he didn't reach for the wallet right away. He looked at her first. You're the one who found it. I am. Thank you. He said it plainly without the practiced smoothness of a man used to having things returned to him, used to being thanked in turn for his gratitude. He picked up the wallet, checked it once quickly, almost apologetically, like he hated that some old instinct made him need to confirm what he already believed. Then he looked up. There was over $11,000 in here. I know, I counted it. And you brought all of it back? Yes. Wyatt. The question wasn't suspicious. It was genuinely curious the way a man asks a question when he actually wants to understand the answer, instead of just filling silence. Amelia considered several versions of a response because it wasn't mine, because it's the right thing to do, because I have 2 kids watching everything I do, and settled on the truest one. Because I have children, she said, and I'd rather they grow up poor and know their mother has integrity than grow up comfortable and learn that it's for sale. Something shifted behind Lucas Rivers's eyes. He was quiet for a moment longer than the silence should have lasted, and Amelia had the strange sensation of being looked at, not as a stranger who'd done a good deed, but as someone he was trying to place, trying to remember, though she was certain they'd never met. That's a remarkable thing to say, he said finally. It's not remarkable, it's just true. She gathered her tote bag, already halfway to standing, uncomfortable now under the weight of his attention, the marble floors, the fountain in the lobby, the whole glass tower of a life she would never live. I should go. My kids are waiting for me. Wait. He said it fast, almost too fast, and then seemed embarrassed by his own urgency. Please, let me at least get your name for my records, in case. He stopped, seemed to search for a reason that wasn't the real one, and failed to find it convincingly. In case I ever need to thank you properly. She hesitated, then decided there was no harm in it. Amelia Banks. His face did something then that she would only understand later, a flicker quick and involuntary. Like a name landing somewhere, it had been waiting a long time to land. But he only nodded, said thank you again, and let her go. It was only after she was back on the bus watching the glass tower shrink behind her through a rain-streaked window that she noticed she'd left her phone case, the old cracked one with the photograph tucked behind the clear plastic back on the conference room table. She didn't think much of it. It was just a photo of her mother smiling, taken maybe 20 years ago on the porch of the house Amelia had grown up in. She'd get it back eventually, or she wouldn't, and either way, life would go on, the way it always did, one stitch at a time, one bill at a time, one small mercy after another. She had no way of knowing that the photograph she'd left behind was about to unravel 15 years of a debt Lucas Rivers had never stopped trying to repay. Lucas didn't move for a long moment after Amelia Banks left the conference room. He stood there with his wallet in one hand and something unfamiliar rising in his chest. Not relief, though he was relieved, and not simple gratitude, though he was certainly grateful. It was recognition. Faint, disorienting, like catching a scent that belongs to a place you haven't been in 15 years and can't quite name. He almost let it go. He had a board call in 20 minutes and a market analysis to review before it, and $11,000 safely returned to his pocket was by any rational measure the end of the story. Then Priya knocked, held up a battered phone case with a cracked corner and said, "She left this. Should I have someone run it after her?" "I'll take it," Lucas said more quickly than the situation required. He turned the case over in his hands, and there behind the clear plastic on the back, faded a little warped from years of being carried in pockets and bags, but unmistakable, was a photograph of a woman on a porch mid-laugh, an apron dusted with flour. One hand raised like she'd been caught telling a joke and hadn't finished it yet. Lucas Rivers, who had built a company from nothing, who had shaken hands with senators and turned down offers from men who owned entire cities, felt his knees go weak in a conference room on the ground floor of his own building. He knew that face. He had spent 15 years trying to find it again. 15 years earlier, Lucas Rivers had been nobody. Not in the way people say it about themselves when they mean humble beginnings and a scrappy start. He had been quite literally nobody, to anyone who mattered. 23 years old, sleeping in the back seat of a car that technically still belonged to a repossession company, eating whatever he could afford from gas station shelves, and carrying inside him the particular exhaustion of a young man who has run out of people to call. His mother had died when he was 19. His father had never been in the picture to begin with. He'd tried college for 2 semesters before the money ran out. Tried 3 different jobs that folded or fired him for reasons that were sometimes his fault and sometimes simply bad luck. And by the time he found himself parked outside a modest house on the edge of a working-class Atlanta neighborhood, he had stopped believing that his life was going to turn into anything. He remembered the house because of the smell first. Something baking, bread maybe, or biscuits. He hadn't eaten a hot meal in 4 days, and the smell alone made his stomach twist so hard he almost drove away rather than sit there and suffer through it. Instead, a woman came out onto the porch. She was maybe 50, wearing an apron dusted with flour, and she looked at his car, clearly, not moving. Clearly, not going anywhere, clearly. A young man who had nowhere else to be, the way some people look at a stray animal that has wandered too close to be ignored. "You've been sitting there an hour," she said. Not accusing, just observing. "Sorry, ma'am. I'll move." "I didn't ask you to move. I asked if you were hungry." He hadn't answered right away, too proud, too raw, with the particular shame of being 23 and unable to feed himself. But she hadn't waited for an answer. She'd gone back inside and come out 10 minutes later with a plate, biscuits, eggs, a thick slice of ham, and set it on the porch railing like it was the most natural thing in the world, like feeding a stranger from her own kitchen cost her nothing at all. "Eat," she said, "and when you're done, there's a blanket in the trunk of my car if you're cold tonight. Nobody should be cold in this city with all these empty guest rooms nobody uses." He'd eaten on her porch steps, and she'd sat a respectful distance away. Shelling peas, not asking him a single question about how he'd ended up there, not once making him explain himself, or perform gratitude, or justify his existence in exchange for a plate of food. When he tried to thank her, she'd waved it off. "I'm not doing this so you'll owe me something," she said. I'm doing it because you're hungry and I have food. That's all it has to be. He came back the next night, and the night after that, always parked a little further down the street, out of some instinct not to overstay a welcome that had never technically been offered. But she always found him, always brought food, sometimes a blanket, once a coat, that she said belonged to her late husband and was just taking up space, might as well be useful. For 3 weeks she fed him. She never asked his last name. She never asked why a young man with clean hands and clear eyes had ended up sleeping in a car. She talked to him about her daughter, about the neighborhood, about a church rummage sale she was organizing, and let him talk or not talk as he chose. And somewhere in those 3 weeks, something in Lucas Rivers that had gone quiet and hard began to soften again. "You're going to be somebody," she told him once out of nowhere while he sat on her steps eating cornbread. "I don't know what yet, but you've got the kind of eyes that don't stay lost forever. Some people's eyes, you look at them and you know they've already given up. Yours haven't. How do you know that?" "Because I've fed a lot of hungry people in my life, young man. You learn to tell the difference." He'd asked her name finally on the last night before he found a job 2 towns over, a warehouse position that came with a signing bonus, just large enough to get him a room and a bus ticket, and eventually the beginning of an idea that would become Rivers Retail Holdings. "Margaret," she'd said, "Margaret Banks." He'd promised himself driving away that final night with a full stomach and a blanket folded on the passenger seat that he would find her again someday, that he would come back and thank her properly. Not with money. He understood instinctively that money wasn't what she'd wanted, wasn't the currency she operated in, but with something that mattered. He would tell her she'd been right, that his eyes hadn't stayed lost, that she was the reason. He went back 6 months later once he'd saved enough to feel like he could show up as something other than a stray. The house was empty. A neighbor told him the woman who'd lived there had passed away suddenly, her heart sudden and quiet the way some good hearts simply stop rather than announcing their failing. She had a daughter, the neighbor said, who'd moved away for a while, but nobody knew where. Lucas had stood on that porch in front of a house with someone else's furniture already visible through the window, and felt something in him break in a way that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the particular grief of owing a debt to someone who could no longer collect it. For 15 years, that debt had sat in him like a stone. He built his company. He gave to shelters, funded meal programs, quietly paid for hundreds of strangers' groceries when he saw them counting change at registers, all of it in Margaret Banks's honor. None of it enough because none of it reached her. And now her daughter had walked into his building holding his wallet, refusing even a reward, saying things about integrity that sounded exactly like something Margaret would have said, and had left behind of all things a photograph of the woman herself. He found Amelia's address through the delivery slip stapled inside the garment bag Priya had noticed folded over the back of a chair in the lobby, a boutique's return address, and from there a name that matched the alteration invoices. It felt, he knew, slightly invasive to track her down this way, and he sat with that discomfort before deciding the alternative, losing her again the way he'd lost her mother, was worse. He drove to the address himself instead of sending an assistant because some things required his own hands, his own voice. Amelia opened the door with a look of confusion that quickly sharpened into wariness when she recognized him. Behind her, he could see a cramped but tidy front room dominated by a sewing table, bolts of fabric stacked with the precision of someone who had learned to make small spaces work hard, and 2 children peering around the doorframe with open curiosity. "Mr. Rivers." She said it carefully, like she was deciding in real time whether this was a threat. "I'm sorry to show up like this. You left your phone case at my office." He held it out and watched her relief flicker across her face before the wariness returned because a billionaire didn't personally deliver a $5 phone case unless something else was going on. "I wanted to bring it myself and to ask you something if you have a minute." About the woman in this photograph." Amelia's expression changed instantly. Something protective closing over her features. The particular guardedness of a person who has learned that their grief is not public property. "That's my mother. She passed away 4 years ago." "Why?" Lucas took a breath and told her. He told her about this car, about the 3 weeks, about the biscuits and the coat and the blanket. He told her that Margaret Banks had never asked his name until the very last night, had never once made him feel like a project or a charity case, had fed him with a dignity that had taught him more about the kind of businessman he wanted to become than any class he'd ever taken. He told her he'd gone back to thank her and found her gone, and that he had spent 15 years unable to close a debt he owed to a dead woman. By the time he finished, Amelia had sat down on the porch step, the same kind of step he realized with an ache that Margaret had once sat on shelling peas and her eyes were wet. "She never told me," Amelia said. "She fed strangers all the time. It was just that's who she was. She'd have never thought to mention one more." "I know. That's exactly who she was." Emma had crept closer, listening with the unabashed attention of a 9-year-old who understands she is hearing something important. "You knew Grandma." "I did," Lucas said, crouching so he was closer to her eye level. "She was one of the kindest people I ever met, and I think your mom is a lot like her." Emma looked at Amelia, something like pride blooming across her face, and Amelia had to look away for a moment, out toward the street, to keep from crying in front of her children. "I don't want your money," Amelia said finally when she trusted her voice again. "I didn't return that wallet hoping for a reward, and I'm not interested in one now, even dressed up as gratitude to my mother. I appreciate you telling me this, I really do. But we don't need—" "I'm not offering money," Lucas said, and meant it. Though the offer had in fact been forming in his mind the entire drive over half-shaped and now discarded, because he understood watching her face that money was exactly the wrong currency here, just as it had been with her mother. "I saw the sewing table behind you. Priya told me the boutique on Peachtree pays alteration rates that wouldn't cover parking downtown. Are those your designs or just alterations?" Amelia hesitated. "Both. I do alterations because they pay, even if not well. I design because I can't stop myself, even though nobody's ever paying me for that part." "Can I see them?" "Why?" "Because I own a fashion company. Ms. Banks and I have spent 15 years wanting to do something for your mother that I never got the chance to do. I'm not going to hand you a check and call it even. But if you have real talent sitting in that sewing room, and I think you might, I'd like to help you build something, on your terms, with your name on it. Not because you're Margaret's daughter, though that matters to me, but because good work deserves a real chance and I have the means to give you one." Amelia studied him for a long moment, the way a woman studies an offer that sounds too good to be a trap and too good to be honest at the same time. "I don't need saving," she said finally. "I'm not offering to save you," Lucas said. "I'm offering to invest in you. There's a difference, and I think you know it." Noah, who had been quietly assessing the stranger in his doorway with the frank suspicion of a 6-year-old, chose that moment to ask, "Are you rich?" "Noah," Amelia said, mortified. "It's a fair question," Lucas said, and smiled at the boy, an easy, unguarded smile that had nothing performative in it. "Yes, I am. But I wasn't always. I used to be hungrier than you've probably ever been, and a woman who looked a lot like the lady in that photograph fed me on her porch steps for 3 weeks and never once asked for anything back. So now when I can, I try to do the same for other people. That's all this is." Noah considered this with the gravity of a judge weighing evidence, then nodded once, apparently satisfied, and disappeared back into the house to resume whatever dinosaur-based diplomacy had been interrupted. Amelia let out a breath that was half laugh, half something raw. "You're serious about this?" "Completely. I have terms," she said, and something in her spine straightened as she said it, the wariness giving way to something sharper and more deliberate. "My name goes on it. My designs stay mine. I make the creative decisions. If you want to invest in that, fine. But I won't be a story you tell at galas about the seamstress you discovered. I'll be a business partner, or this doesn't happen." Lucas felt something in his chest loosen. Not disappointment, but recognition. The same recognition he'd felt the moment he saw the photograph. This was Margaret's daughter, unmistakably right down to the refusal to be anyone's charity case. "Those are exactly the terms I was hoping to hear," he said.
But yeah.
That night after Lucas had gone and the kids were finally asleep, Amelia sat at her sewing table with the lamp pulled close, running her fingers over a half-finished sketch she'd never shown anyone, a coat design structured but soft, inspired by nothing in particular, except the shape she imagined when she thought about the word dignity. She thought about her mother feeding a stranger on the porch steps, without ever once mentioning it, without needing credit or thanks, simply because a hungry young man had parked outside her house, and she had food to share. 15 years later, that same kindness had circled back to her wearing an expensive suit and driving a car Amelia would never be able to afford, offering not charity, but partnership, not rescue, but respect. She didn't know yet whether to trust it completely. Trust for Amelia had become a luxury she rationed as carefully as the last of Noah's inhaler medicine. But she picked up her pencil anyway and began to sketch, because whatever this turned out to be, she intended to walk into it exactly as her mother had raised her, with her hands steady, her name on her own work and her integrity intact. She had no idea sketching by lamplight, while her children slept down the hall, that the coat taking shape under her pencil would one day hang in the window of a boutique bearing both her name and Lucas Rivers, a testament to a debt of gratitude finally fully repaid. The partnership grew slowly the way real things do. Lucas didn't sweep in with a team of stylists and a marketing budget that would have drowned Amelia's voice before it ever found its footing. Instead, he started small, almost invisibly, a proper sewing machine to replace the one held together with a rubber band, and hope a small studio space above a bakery 2 blocks from her house so she wouldn't have to work out of her living room anymore. A part-time assistant 3 days a week so Amelia could sleep more than 5 hours a night for the first time in years. "This isn't charity," he reminded her the first time she balked at the studio space, running her hand along a wall like she expected it to be an illusion. "This is a business expense. You can't build a brand out of your living room forever, and I'm not paying for it out of kindness. I'm paying for it because I expect a return, and I think you're going to give me one." "You're very good at making generosity sound like spreadsheets," Amelia said. "I've had practice." She laughed a real laugh, one of the first he'd heard from her, and something in his chest warmed in a way he tried not to examine too closely. Over the following months, Amelia's designs found their shape. She worked from instinct and memory, drawing on the practical structured tailoring she'd learned doing alterations, but layering in details that were entirely her own. Hand-finished seams, reclaimed vintage buttons she sourced from estate sales. A signature high-waisted silhouette that flattered real bodies instead of runway ones. Lucas never once told her what to design. He asked questions, smart ones, about fabric cost, about production timelines, about who exactly would wear this and why, but he never once suggested she change her vision to fit someone else's idea of marketable. Emma and Noah adjusted to the new rhythm of their mother's life with the resilience children carry so easily once they understand nothing essential has actually changed. Emma took to hanging around the studio after school, folding fabric swatches into neat stacks, with the same quiet pride she'd once brought to folding finished hems, occasionally offering opinions on color combinations that were, Amelia had to admit, better than her own. Noah adopted Lucas with the swift, uncomplicated loyalty of a 6-year-old who had decided a person was safe. "He doesn't talk to me like I'm a kid," Noah told his mother one evening apropos of nothing while eating dinner. "He asks me stuff and actually listens to what I say back." "That's because you say smart things," Amelia said, and meant it, watching her son's face light up in a way that made her throat tight. Lucas came by more often than the partnership strictly required, dropping off fabric samples he'd found on business trips, showing up for Noah's school science fair, because Amelia had mentioned it in passing, and he remembered sitting through an entire evening of Emma explaining in exhaustive 9-year-old detail the plot of a book she was reading. He never overstayed. He never brought gifts that felt like bribery. No new bikes, no expensive toys, nothing that smelled like a man trying to buy his way into a family's affection. He brought attention instead, the kind that cost nothing and meant everything, and Amelia watched her children fall for him slowly and completely, in a way she found herself against every instinct toward caution falling for him too. The showcase was Lucas's idea, though he framed it correctly as an inevitability rather than a gift. "You have 12 finished pieces and a story nobody else has," he told her. "The industry needs to see this, not because I'm arranging it as a favor, but because hiding it would be a waste." Amelia spent 6 weeks preparing refining pieces late into the night, after the kids were asleep, second-guessing every choice, and then trusting her instincts again, the way her mother had taught her to trust her hands, even when her mind was afraid. The night of the showcase, held in a converted warehouse space with exposed brick and warm lighting that Lucas had chosen specifically because it felt honest rather than glossy. Amelia stood backstage in a room full of buyers, journalists, and fashion editors, and felt her hand shake for the first time in years. "You don't have to do this alone," Lucas said, finding her there straightening a garment rack that didn't need straightening. "I think I do, actually," Amelia said. "This is the first thing that's ever been entirely mine. I need to know I can carry it." He didn't argue. He simply nodded and said, "Then go carry it," and stepped back to let her do exactly that. The showcase went better than either of them had dared hope. Buyers responded to the honesty in the tailoring, the way each piece looked like it had been made for a specific real body rather than an abstraction. Journalists asked questions about her process, and Amelia answered them plainly without artifice, describing her mother's hands guiding hers over a sewing machine at 8 years old, describing the years of alterations that had taught her more about how clothes actually move on real people than any design school could have. It was in the reception that followed glass of sparkling water in her hand, because she didn't drink and had never learned to fake it convincingly, that a man named Gerald Whitfield approached her with an offer that made her stomach drop before he'd even finished the sentence. "Extraordinary work," he said, shaking her hand with the confident grip of a man used to being the most important person in any room. He was an investor, he explained, representing a group interested in acquiring emerging labels and scaling them for mass retail. "I want to buy the collection outright. All 12 pieces, full manufacturing rights, and we'd love to bring you on as a consultant." "A consultant," Amelia repeated carefully. The label would need a different name for market positioning, something more established sounding, more aspirational. "But your design sensibility, your story, we'd absolutely want to keep that in the marketing. Inspired by is very compelling to consumers right now." "You want my designs?" Amelia said slowly, "without my name on them. Think of the numbers, Miss Banks." Gerald named a figure that made the room tilt slightly around her, enough to clear every debt she'd ever carried, enough to buy a house outright, enough to guarantee Emma and Noah a future free of the anxious arithmetic that had defined Amelia's entire adult life. This is generational money, and frankly, the industry rarely offers women in your position a second chance like this. Amelia looked across the room where Lucas stood in conversation with a buyer, deliberately giving her space to navigate this conversation without his interference. Though she could feel his attention on her even from a distance, ready if she needed him, and invisible if she didn't. She thought about the debt notices that used to sit in her kitchen drawer. She thought about 6 years of counting pennies, of stretching medicine doses, of choosing between the electric bill and new shoes for growing feet. She thought about her mother feeding a hungry stranger on a porch step and never once asking for anything back. Not credit, not thanks, not even his name until the very end. "I appreciate the offer," Amelia said, and her voice to her own surprise didn't shake. "But I'm not for sale, and neither is my name." Gerald's smile faltered just slightly, the practiced warmth cooling into something more transactional. "You understand what you're turning down." "I understand exactly what I'm turning down," Amelia said. "I'm turning down money I desperately need in exchange for erasing myself from my own work. My mother used to say that if you lose your integrity, you've already paid too high a price for whatever you got in exchange for it. I've spent 6 years learning what that costs. I'm not spending tonight finding out what it costs to lose it." She turned and walked toward the small raised platform where the evening's remarks were being given, and when the moderator gestured for her to say a few words unplanned, she found herself speaking not from notes, but from somewhere deeper. "Some of you are wondering why a woman who spent years struggling to make ends meet would turn down a life-changing offer tonight," she said, and the room, which had been murmuring with cocktail conversation, went quiet. "The truth is, I almost didn't. The truth is, 6 months ago I found a stranger's wallet with more money in it than I make in half a year, and for about 30 seconds I thought about keeping it. I didn't, because my mother raised me to believe that integrity is the one thing you can't buy back once you've sold it. She taught me that lesson at a kitchen table, not a design school, and it's the only reason any of you are looking at these clothes tonight instead of looking at a woman who gave up." She looked for just a moment toward Lucas, who was watching her with an expression she couldn't fully read. Pride, certainly, but something else beneath it. Something that looked almost like recognition, like watching someone finish a sentence he'd started 15 years ago and never gotten to complete. "My name is on every piece in this room," Amelia continued, "because my name is the only thing I've ever truly owned outright. I'm not selling it tonight, not for any number." The applause that followed was not the polite, obligatory kind. It rolled through the warehouse in a wave, and Amelia stood on that small platform with her hands finally steady, understanding for the first time in her adult life what it felt like to be applauded not for what she could offer someone else, but for refusing to give herself away.
Yeah.
Later, after the crowd had thinned and the warehouse lights had dimmed to something softer, Lucas found her sitting alone at the edge of the room, shoes off feet, aching, the adrenaline of the evening finally draining out of her in a long exhale. "You could have taken that offer," he said, sitting beside her without asking permission, the easy familiarity of a man who had earned the right to sit close. "Nobody would have blamed you, not with everything you've carried." "I know. Why didn't you?" Amelia considered the question seriously the way she considered most things. Because I've spent my whole adult life being told that people like me have to choose between dignity and survival, that we should be grateful for whatever crumbs get offered on whatever terms someone else sets. My mother never believed that, not for one day of her life, even when she had every reason to. I wasn't about to prove her wrong the first time someone waved real money at me. Lucas was quiet for a long moment, watching her in the dim light with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the look of a man doing careful, deliberate math in his head, weighing something before he let himself say it out loud. "I didn't bring you into this to repay a debt to your mother," he said finally. "I mean, I did at first. That's honestly how it started. But somewhere in the last few months that stopped being the reason." "What's the reason now?" "You," he said simply. "Just you. Your talent, obviously, but more than that, the way you refused to compromise, the way you raised those two extraordinary kids on nothing, the way you looked at $11,000 in cash and didn't even hesitate to hand it back to a stranger. I've spent 15 years trying to find a way to repay one debt of gratitude. I didn't expect to fall in love with the daughter along the way." Amelia's breath caught. Whatever she'd expected from tonight, triumph, exhaustion, relief, she hadn't expected. This hadn't let herself imagine it, because imagining it felt like a risk she couldn't afford. The way she'd once thought new shoes were a risk, she couldn't afford the way she'd once thought hope itself was a luxury reserved for people with fewer bills. "Lucas, you don't have to answer tonight," he said quickly, gently, backing off the way he'd learned to do from months of respecting her pace, her terms, her ownership of every decision in her own life. "I just needed you to know it wasn't about the debt anymore. Whatever happens with the business, whatever happens with us, I needed you to know that." Amelia looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had never once tried to buy his way into her children's hearts, who had built her a studio and then stepped back to let her fill it with her own vision, who had sat quietly across the room tonight and let her fight her own battle instead of fighting it for her. "Ask me again," she said softly, "when this doesn't feel so much like the middle of the biggest night of my life." "I will," Lucas said, and something in his face, relief maybe, or simply hope, cautiously aloud, told her he meant to keep that promise. Neither of them spoke of it again that night. But something had shifted between them unmistakably, the way a garment shifts once the final seam is set, and the shape it was always meant to hold finally becomes visible. The weeks following the showcase moved fast in a way Amelia hadn't expected, faster than the years of careful, penny-counted sameness that had preceded them. A fashion blog picked up footage of her impromptu speech, and within days it had been shared far beyond the small circle of buyers and editors who'd attended in person. A local news station ran a segment, "Single Mom's Honesty Becomes Fashion's Newest Story," that made Amelia wince at the headline, but couldn't deny brought orders flooding in from customers who'd never have found her otherwise. She handled it the way she handled everything, carefully, deliberately, refusing to let the sudden attention outpace the actual quality of her work. When a national morning show requested an interview, she agreed only after negotiating that the segment would focus on her design process rather than turning her family's hardship into entertainment. When a fast fashion conglomerate reached out with a licensing offer far larger than Gerald Whitfield's, she declined within a day without needing to deliberate the way she had the first time. "You didn't even blink at that one," Lucas observed, looking over the rejection email she'd drafted with the same steady hand she used for her sketches. "I already know what I'm worth," Amelia said. "The first offer taught me that. I don't need to relearn the lesson every time somebody dangles a bigger number." Lucas kept himself carefully in the background of her rising visibility, a decision Amelia noticed and appreciated more than she said aloud. When journalists asked about his involvement, he described himself simply as an investor and a friend, deflecting credit with the same instinct that had made him uncomfortable all those years ago, accepting food from Margaret Banks without being able to repay her properly. He attended the morning show taping, but stood off camera. He funded the production run for her second collection, but let Amelia's name appear alone on the press release. He seemed to understand in a way few people in his position ever bothered to understand, that the surest way to support someone was to make sure the spotlight never confused itself with him. "You could take more credit," Amelia told him one evening, the two of them going over fabric invoices at her studio table long after the assistant had gone home. "Nobody would blame you for it. You're the reason any of this was possible." "I'm the reason you had capital," Lucas said. "I'm not the reason any of it is good. That's yours. I'd rather people know the truth of who made this than watch me take a bow for someone else's work. I've spent my whole career watching men do that to people who couldn't push back. I'm not interested in becoming one of them. Amelia set down her pen and looked at him for a long moment. Really looked the way she rarely let herself look at anyone anymore, having learned the hard way that looking too closely at people usually preceded disappointment. What she saw in Lucas's face wasn't performance. It was simply the truth of who he'd decided to be built slowly and deliberately out of the wreckage of who he might have become if a stranger hadn't fed him on a porch step 15 years ago and asked for nothing back. Bah. Emma and Noah's affection for Lucas deepened in the unhurried way children's affections do when nothing is forced and nobody is trying too hard. He came to Noah's soccer game standing at the edge of the field with Amelia cheering with the same enthusiasm he might have reserved for closing a major deal, though Noah's team lost more often than it won. He read the fantasy novel Emma was obsessed with, not because anyone asked him to, but because she'd mentioned it once, and he wanted to be able to talk to her about the parts that mattered to her. "Do you think you'll marry my mom?" Noah asked him one afternoon, with the devastating directness only a 6-year-old can deploy, while the two of them sat on the studio steps waiting for Amelia to finish a fitting. Lucas didn't laugh the question off, and he didn't deflect it either. "I think that's a decision your mom and I would make together if we ever got there," he said honestly. "But if we did, it would only happen because she wanted it too, and because you and Emma felt good about it. That matters more to me than almost anything else." "Good answer," Noah said with the solemn approval of a judge, and returned to his coloring book apparently satisfied that the matter had been handled appropriately. Emma, older and more perceptive, brought it up differently one night while helping fold fabric in the studio. "You like him," she said, not a question. Amelia considered lying or deflecting the way she might have a year ago, back when admitting to hope felt like inviting disappointment. But something had shifted in her over the last several months, not just in her business, but in the part of herself that had spent 6 years bracing for the next hardship, instead of trusting the next kindness. "I do," Amelia admitted. "But I want you to know something. Whatever happens between me and Lucas, it doesn't change what happens between you and me. You and your brother come first. You always will." "I know that," Emma said in the matter-of-fact tone of a 9-year-old who has never once doubted it. "I just think Grandma would like him. He's kind the way she was kind. Not because he wants something back." Amelia had to turn away for a moment, blinking hard, because her daughter had just articulated in 11 words the exact thing Amelia had been circling around for months without quite letting herself land on it. Lucas visited Margaret's grave on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, alone, without telling Amelia beforehand, because some things needed to happen privately before they could be shared. The cemetery was modest, the headstone simple. Margaret Ann Banks' beloved mother, and a set of dates that measured out a life Lucas had only glimpsed for 3 weeks, 15 years earlier. He knelt in the grass, feeling slightly foolish and entirely sincere at once, and spoke aloud the way he imagined she might have wanted him to, the way she'd once talked to him on her porch steps, without ever needing him to perform gratitude in return. "I found her," he said. "Your daughter. I don't know if you'd call it fate or coincidence, but either way I found her, and she's exactly the kind of woman you raised her to be. Stubborn about the right things, generous in a way that costs her something. She turned down more money than either of us ever had twice because she wouldn't put her name up for sale." He paused, running a hand over the edge of the headstone, feeling the rough granite under his palm. "You fed me for 3 weeks and never once asked for anything back. I spent 15 years wanting to pay that debt, and I finally understand I can't, not directly, not to you. But I think I can pay it forward the way you'd have wanted. I think I'm falling in love with your daughter, and I think if you were here, you'd tell me exactly what you told me the last night I saw you, that some people's eyes don't stay lost forever. I think hers haven't either, even after everything life put her through. I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure they never have reason to go lost again." He stayed a while longer, the Atlanta afternoon warm and quiet around him, before rising, brushing the grass from his knees, and driving back toward the studio, toward Amelia, toward whatever came next. That evening, after the children were in bed, Amelia found him sitting on her porch step, the same step she realized, with a soft ache where he'd once told her about a woman with flour-dusted hands and a plate of biscuits offered without condition. "You went to see her," Amelia said. It wasn't a question. She'd noticed the faint grass stains on his slacks, the particular quiet in his manner that suggested he'd been somewhere that required stillness. "I did. I wanted to tell her something, and I realized I needed to say it there before I could say it here." "What did you tell her?" Lucas looked at Amelia in the porch light, the same light under which her mother had once shelled peas and fed a stranger without ever asking for his name, and felt the full weight of 15 years settle into something that finally at long last felt like it was resolving. That I love her daughter, he said simply. That I think I have for a while now, longer than I let myself admit, because falling in love with you felt like it might complicate a debt I owed to your mother, and I didn't want to dishonor that by making it about something else. But it's not separate anymore, Amelia. It's not repayment, and it's not gratitude. It's just you. It's the way you draw with your whole hand curled around the pencil like you're afraid the idea will get away from you if you don't hold on tight enough. It's the way you negotiate every contract, like you're still protecting two kids from a world that once tried to take everything from you. It's just you and I love you, and I've been waiting for the right moment to say it since the night of the showcase. Amelia sat down beside him on the step close enough that their shoulders touched, and let herself finally fully feel the things she'd been circling for months without daring to name. I fell in love with you somewhere around the third time you let Noah win at checkers, and pretended not to notice you were losing on purpose, she said, and Lucas laughed. Surprised, delighted. But I think if I'm honest, it started earlier than that. It started when you told me you weren't offering to save me. Nobody had ever said that to me before. Everyone else always wanted to save me, or fix me, or feel good about themselves for helping the struggling single mother. You just wanted to invest in what I already had. Because you never needed saving, Lucas said. You needed someone to see what was already there. Amelia leaned her head against his shoulder, and for the first time in 6 years, the quiet of the evening felt like peace instead of exhaustion, like the settling stillness after a long day's work, rather than the held breath of waiting for the next disaster. I love you too, she said. I have for a while. I just didn't want to say it until I trusted it wasn't going to be taken away from me the second I did. It won't be, Lucas said. Not by me. They sat together on the porch step as the evening deepened around them, and somewhere behind the curtained window, Emma stirred in her sleep, and Noah dreamed of dinosaurs and the whole small, hard-won world Amelia had built. Stitch by stitch, dollar by dollar, stayed exactly as safe and whole as she had always fought to keep it. Except now it held a little more room than it used to. Room enough for a man who had spent 15 years trying to repay a kindness and had finally found the truest way to do it. Not by settling a debt, but by building a family, worthy of the woman who'd first shown him what generosity without condition looked like. 1 year later, Banks and Rivers' atelier occupied a storefront on a tree-lined stretch of Atlanta that had over the past decade transformed from struggling to sought after without ever quite losing the neighborhood warmth that had once made Margaret Banks's porch a gathering place for anyone who needed a hot meal and a kind word. The boutique's windows were dressed simply. No glossy mannequins posed in aggressive angles, just soft lighting on structured handcrafted garments that looked to anyone who stopped to study them like clothes made by someone who understood exactly how a real body moved through a real day. Amelia stood in the center of it on opening night, feeling the particular vertigo of a woman standing inside a dream she'd once been too afraid to fully imagine and thought, as she often did lately of her mother. The label had grown carefully over the past year exactly the way Amelia had insisted it should. She was creative director and majority owner. Lucas remained a business partner and investor, his name on the letterhead, but never on the credit that mattered, always deferring the spotlight to the woman whose vision the label actually carried. Together, they'd expanded the workshop to employ 11 seamstresses. Most of them single parents, Amelia had specifically sought out through community centers and local churches offering fair wages. Flexible hours built around school pickups and the same dignity of ownership over their work that she herself had once been denied. We're not just making clothes, she'd told Lucas early in the planning when he'd asked what she wanted the company's culture to look like. We're making sure nobody who works here ever has to choose between integrity and survival the way I almost did. That's the whole point of any of this. He'd agreed without hesitation because he told her exactly what he'd hoped she'd say. The grand opening drew a crowd that spilled onto the sidewalk buyers and press certainly, but also neighbors. Former alteration clients who'd known Amelia when she was still working out of her living room and the mothers of children from Emma's and Noah's school who'd followed the local news coverage with genuine pride rather than mere curiosity. Emma, now 10, moved through the crowd with the confident poise of a girl who had grown up watching her mother refuse to be diminished, offering guests sparkling cider in delicate glasses and answering questions about the fabric with more expertise than most adults in the room. Noah, 7, had appointed himself official greeter, shaking hands solemnly with every guest who entered and informing at least 3 separate journalists that his mother makes the best clothes in the whole world, probably the whole country. Near the entrance, mounted in a simple frame with soft gallery lighting, hung the photograph Amelia had once left behind in a stranger's conference room. Her mother mid-laugh on a porch flower dusting her apron, one hand raised as though she'd been caught telling a joke she hadn't finished yet. Beneath it, engraved on a small brass plaque, was a single line Amelia had spent weeks drafting and redrafting until it finally captured everything she wanted it to hold. One act of kindness can become someone else's future. She'd insisted on the plaque over Lucas's gentle suggestion that perhaps something about her own hard work deserved equal billing. "This place doesn't exist because I worked hard," she'd told him. "Plenty of people work hard, and it isn't enough because the door never opens for them. This place exists because my mother fed a hungry stranger without asking what she'd get back, and because that stranger spent 15 years looking for a way to pay it forward instead of just paying it back. That's the whole story. I want people to understand that when they walk in." Guests lingered in front of the photograph all evening, many of them reading the plaque twice, several dabbing at their eyes in the unself-conscious way people do when a stranger's grief and gratitude somehow manages to touch their own. Late in the evening, once the crowd had thinned to close friends and family, Amelia found herself standing near the entrance beside Lucas, watching Emma explain the workshop's ethical sourcing practices to an elderly customer with the patient authority of a girl twice her age, watching Noah finally succumb to exhaustion and curl up asleep on a velvet bench near the register. "We did it," Amelia said quietly, more to herself than to him, still slightly disbelieving of the word, we still occasionally bracing out of old habit for the ground to shift beneath something good. "You did it," Lucas corrected gently. "I just made sure the door stayed open long enough for you to walk through it. That's not nothing you know. Plenty of people never get anyone to hold the door. Your mother held it for me first," Lucas said. "I was just passing it along." Amelia turned to look at him, at the man who had spent 15 years carrying a debt of gratitude he could never fully repay, who had found in the end that the truest repayment wasn't a transaction at all, but a whole life built in someone's honor, a business that employed struggling parents. 2 children who'd grown up believing kindness and dignity could coexist, a woman he loved who no longer had to choose between integrity and survival because he'd made sure she never had to again. "I keep thinking about that day on 5th Street, Amelia said. "If it hadn't been raining, if I'd walked 2 minutes earlier or later and never seen that wallet, if I'd kept the money instead of finding you, none of this would exist, or it would have found another way," Lucas said. "I don't think kindness like your mother's just disappears when the person who gave it dies. I think it goes looking for somewhere to land, and eventually it finds it. It found me on her porch 15 years ago. It found you on 5th Street last year. I don't think that was chance, Amelia. I think that was just your mother's kindness still moving through the world, looking for the next person who needed it." Amelia felt her eyes fill not with the raw grief that used to accompany memories of her mother, but with something gentler now, something closer to gratitude, fully at peace with itself. "She'd be proud of you," Lucas said. "Both of us, I hope, but especially you. Everything you built here, you built with your own hands on your own terms without ever once compromising what she taught you." "She'd be proud of us," Amelia said, correcting him the way he'd once corrected her, and reached for his hand. Outside the windows of Banks and Rivers' atelier, Atlanta moved through its ordinary evening full of its own quiet struggles and unremarked kindnesses. Someone somewhere counting change at a register. Someone else offering a stranger a warm meal without expecting anything back. The whole unglamorous machinery of decency that keeps turning quietly beneath the surface of any city, mostly invisible, occasionally remarkably returning to those who need it most, exactly when they need it most. Amelia Banks had once returned a lost wallet on a rainy afternoon because her mother had raised her to believe that integrity was worth more than any amount of money that could be counted. She had no way of knowing, handing that wallet back to a stranger in a downtown lobby, that she was also returning something else entirely. Hope long deferred to a man who had spent 15 years searching for a way to repay a kindness that had changed the entire shape of his life. Some debts, it turned out, could never really be repaid. They could only be passed forward hand to hand porch. Step to porch step 1. Act of undeserved kindness, quietly becoming someone else's unimaginable future. And on the wall near the door of a small, thriving fashion label in Atlanta, Georgia, a woman with flour on her apron and a joke she never finished kept smiling out at everyone who walked through as if she'd known all along exactly how this story would end.